What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Details from the short, tragic life of H.P. Lovecraft. Howard Phillips H.P. Lovecraft is known as the father of cosmic horror, yet it wasn't until years after he perished in 1937 that his work gained critical acclaim. A man of prejudicial convictions and the subject of many rumors, Lovecraft's work holds up in part for how shockingly horrifying it was to early 20th century readers. Lovecraft's work continues to influence the philosophical and psychological tones of celebrated projects like the Duffer Brothers' Stranger Things, Blizzard Entertainment's World of Warcraft, and the 1960s rock band H.P. Lovecraft. Many of Lovecraft's stories are daringly vague, allowing room for artists to interpret his work in increasingly unique adaptations to this day. Lovecraft's genuine distaste for mankind and problematic beliefs, however, left him with a fractured legacy. Many of his horror stories were inspired by his childhood encounters with night gaunts. From an early age, Lovecraft was terrorized by what he called night gaunts, which caused him anxiety and restless sleep. Later in life, Lovecraft fictionalized these night gaunts as long, dark, and faceless monsters who would tickle their prey into capitulation. In 1918, Lovecraft wrote a letter regarding his response to the terrible apparitions. Do you realize that to many men it makes a vast and profound difference whether or not the things about them are as they appear? If truth amounts to nothing, then we must regard the phantasma of our slumbers just as seriously as the events of our daily lives. He was pulled from organized education when he was about 8. After his father perished from syphilis when Lovecraft was only 8 years old and quite sickly, his mother pulled him from formal education. The boy was a voracious reader, especially when it came to astronomy and chemistry. By 9 years old, he was writing his own commentary on scientific topics. Lovecraft is largely credited with being one of the first writers to combine Gothic horror with supernatural elements and monsters who would often defeat traditional human protagonists. He ghostwrote an allegedly true story for Harry Houdini. Lovecraft was asked by the editor of Weird Tales to ghostwrite a column for famous magician and escape artist Harry Houdini in 1924. Under the Pyramids, told the allegedly true tale of Houdini being taken by an Egyptian tour guide who resembled an ancient pharaoh, only to meet the deity that inspired the Great Sphinx of Giza. Although Lovecraft reportedly had his suspicions that the story was fabricated, he happily took a large advance of $100 to pen it. An elated Houdini continued to commission Lovecraft for several other projects. He might have written 100,000 letters. Despite his early demise at the age of 46 as a result of intestinal cancer, Lovecraft managed to write 100,000 letters, according to L. Sprague de Camp's H.P. Lovecraft. A biography. Well, Joshi calculated that only 20,000 of those letters actually survived. Less than 1,000 were printed from 1911 to 1937. In many of his letters, written to such contemporaries as fellow writers Robert Bloch, Psycho, Henry Kuttner, The Dark World, and poet Samuel Loveman, Lovecraft talks candidly about his philosophy, interests, and dreams, and why they were sometimes more poignant than his fiction. He considered himself an amateur astronomer. On March 25, 1923, Lovecraft wrote to Clark Ashton Schmidt, "Astronomy has always been my favorite science, followed assiduously since I was 12 years old." Many of Lovecraft's stories made the mythos of astronomy readily accessible to an early 20th century audience that was hungry to know more about the cosmos. Despite never finishing high school due to a nervous breakdown, Lovecraft wrote many articles and scholarly papers based on his astronomical observations that were published in newspapers such as the Providence Evening News and the Asheville Gazette News. In 1904, Lovecraft wrote the annual report on the science of astronomy, which included drawings and notes detailing his view of the galaxy. He kept a log of the negative effects of his intestinal cancer. Lovecraft suffered from intestinal cancer, and reportedly kept a diary in which he recorded clinical notes for his physician. Though the diary is assumed lost, his confidant Robert Barlow reportedly made a partial copy, condensing the remainder of the text. Examples of Lovecraft's journal entries can be found in The Death of a Gentleman, The Last Days of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, written by his neighbor R. Alan Everts and Collected Essays, Volume 5 from Hippocampus Press. In the 2 months before he passed, Lovecraft detailed the symptoms of his declining health, focusing more and more on his pointed suffering. "Sometimes the pain is unbearable," he wrote. From the agony in his gut to the swelling in his feet, Lovecraft suffered from edema that worked in concert with his intestinal cancer. Regions of the galaxy are named after Lovecraft and his monsters. Despite Pluto being the only Kuiper Belt object discovered during Lovecraft's lifetime, there is a region of Pluto named after one of his monsters. Following the results of an online poll in 2015, Cthulhu macula was the name given to the prominent whale-shaped surface found on the dwarf planet. One of the longest and darkest features of Pluto, Cthulhu macula contains many craters and linear traits, which suggest it is billions of years old. The Call of Cthulhu is one of Lovecraft's most celebrated short stories. It features a mythical beast that sleeps at the bottom of the ocean for an eternity, waiting to arise in an apocalyptic age. Planetary geologist Rachel Klima led an effort to name a crater on Mercury after Lovecraft, calling it the Lovecraft Crater. The crater is shrouded in darkness and evokes feelings of something mysterious lurking below. Lovecraft described himself as a recluse, but he wasn't. Lovecraft, an autodidact, would stay up late into the night studying astronomy and writing his brand of pulp fiction. His gaunt, pale look and long face supposedly led to his own mother calling him grotesque during adolescence. In 1926, Lovecraft wrote, "I am essentially a recluse who will have very little to do with people wherever he may be. I think that most people only make me nervous, that only by accident and in extremely small quantities would I ever be likely to come across people who wouldn't." As he detailed in many of his letters, however, Lovecraft regularly traveled the eastern seaboard and kept a tight-knit group of friends. In his travel logs such as Observations on Several Parts of America, an account of a visit to Charleston, and a description of the town of Quebec in New France, Lovecraft reports going as far north as Canada, as far south as Florida and Louisiana, and as far west as Ohio. Lovecraft held racially prejudiced views. Despite his acclaimed literature, Lovecraft held many problematic opinions that he openly discussed. Joshi's Lord of a Visible World, an autobiography in letters, chronicles Lovecraft's prejudices for people of all cultures different from his own. Philip Isle of The Atlantic wrote a column in 2015 where he recounts a quote from Lovecraft expressing vitriolic anti-Semitic opinions, as well as lamenting his New England neighbors for being undesirable Latins, low-grade Southern Italians and Portuguese, and the clamorous plague of French Canadians. In 1934, Lovecraft wrote a letter lauding the extra-legal measures terrorizing the black community in Mississippi and Alabama as ingenious. His literary executor started out as a young boy who published fan magazines. Photo: Avon Novels, Incorporated, Wikimedia Commons public domain. His literary executor started out as a young boy who published fan magazines. Robert Barlow began corresponding with Lovecraft in 1931, and the two decided to meet in Barlow's hometown of DeLand, Florida. Though the 43-year-old Lovecraft was unaware that Barlow was only 16 at the time, the two developed a deep friendship that included composing couplets and Barlow typing many of Lovecraft's manuscripts. When Lovecraft passed in March 1937, he named Barlow as his literary executor. Bestowed as an honor, Barlow published 75 copies of Lovecraft's commonplace book in a letterpress edition that many of Lovecraft's professional disciples took as treason. Two such men, August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, wanted Lovecraft's stories placed in one book, and made it their mission to tarnish Barlow's reputation for the rest of the small science fiction community. Barlow would go on to become an anthropologist with a focus on early Mesoamerican history. And although he was later named chair of Mexico City College's anthropology department, sharing Lovecraft's work was still a major part of his life. Barlow gave many of Lovecraft's manuscripts to Brown University, while adapting some of Lovecraft's themes in his own stories of Aztec gods. Lovecraft hated living in Brooklyn. Soon after marrying Sonia Green, who was 7 years his elder and despised by his two aunts, the couple moved to Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, New York, because his wife felt she needed to leave Providence in order to flourish, and she was willing to support her husband financially through her dress shop. Although Lovecraft initially took to his new home, even becoming part of a close group of intellectual and literary friends dubbed the Calum Club, Sonia soon lost her shop and moved to Ohio for a new opportunity. Lovecraft, alone and penniless in the Red Hook area of Brooklyn, soon began to despise living in New York City. He reveled in his angst in the short story, The Horror at Red Hook. Living in a city with a large immigrant population, the narrator of the story wrote, "My coming to New York had been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me." Before moving back to Providence, Lovecraft rented a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights. It was around this time that he began to write the thematic outline for The Call of Cthulhu. Lovecraft is rumored to have been homosexual, though he openly objected to gay relationships. Speculation often paints Lovecraft as homosexual due to the fact that he kept many male friends who were openly gay, including Robert Barlow, Samuel Loveman, and Hart Crane. Other reports claim, however, that Lovecraft wasn't even aware of their orientation. He was briefly married to Sonia Green, who writes about their close relationship in Memories of Lovecraft. And in a February 1933 letter to J. Vernon Shea, Lovecraft wrote, "So far as the case of homosexuality goes, the primary and vital objection against it is that it is naturally, physically and involuntarily, not merely morally or aesthetically, repugnant to the overwhelming bulk of mankind." Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the pale recluse from Providence, Rhode Island, who would become posthumously revered as the father of cosmic horror, lived a life so steeped in tragedy, contradiction, and psychological torment that it's almost fitting that his stories often blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Born in 1890 into a once wealthy family that swiftly descended into financial ruin and mental instability, Lovecraft's early years were defined by sickness, isolation, and the terrifying specters of his own imagination. By the time he was 3, his father was institutionalized for late-stage syphilis, an illness that would eventually kill him and leave Lovecraft under the obsessive care of his emotionally fragile mother, who herself would later die in an asylum. Plagued by vivid nightmares of faceless winged creatures he later dubbed night gaunts, Lovecraft began crafting eerie stories as a way to process the dark shapes that haunted his childhood dreams, and those visions would later populate the warped mythos that fans and scholars now call the Cthulhu mythos. With a nervous disposition and numerous physical ailments, Lovecraft was pulled out of school at age 8, just after suffering what would later be described as a nervous breakdown, and he never returned to complete his formal education. Instead, he educated himself obsessively in classical literature, chemistry, and especially astronomy, which he considered his truest passion. He published homemade science magazines and wrote scholarly articles under pseudonyms, and while his fiction ultimately became his lasting legacy, Lovecraft himself always saw scientific writing and poetic verse as more noble pursuits. Despite his crippling social anxiety, he developed a passion for correspondence and is believed to have written over 100,000 letters in his lifetime, many of them essays unto themselves, detailing his strange philosophies, morbid fascinations, and often appallingly racist opinions. These letters are now studied alongside his fiction because they reveal the full complexity of his psyche, a man who could invent cosmic pantheons and time-warped horrors, yet also speak with real tenderness about his love of architecture, cats, and Elizabethan prose. Lovecraft's earliest paid fiction gigs came through Weird Tales, where he was commissioned in 1924 to ghostwrite a supposedly true story for famed escape artist Harry Houdini, which became Under the Pyramids. The tale fused Houdini's real-life persona with Lovecraft's surreal vision of an ancient Egypt teeming with buried gods and slumbering monsters, and despite Lovecraft suspecting the story was fabricated, he eagerly pocketed the $100 paycheck, one of the few financial windfalls of his impoverished life. Though he began to gain a niche following in the pulp community, he remained practically destitute, living in decaying apartments and boarding houses, dependent on his dwindling inheritance and the goodwill of friends. In 1924, he married Sonia Green, a Jewish businesswoman 7 years his senior, an eyebrow-raising union for a man whose private writings were often filled with appallingly anti-Semitic and xenophobic remarks. The marriage was doomed from the start. His two aunts disapproved, his own prejudices loomed like a shadow, and when Sonia lost her business and moved to Ohio for work, Lovecraft stayed behind in Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood, where he spiraled into poverty, paranoia, and creative anguish. His horror story, The Horror at Red Hook, is now infamous for channeling that despair into grotesque depictions of urban squalor and thinly veiled racial panic. His reputation grew like the ancient evils in his stories, slowly at first, then ferociously. The posthumous explosion of interest in his work led to an avalanche of scholarly studies, adaptations, and homages. Filmmakers like John Carpenter, Guillermo del Toro, and Stuart Gordon took inspiration from Lovecraft's unique brand of horror, in which protagonists are undone not by monsters per se, but by the vast, uncaring forces of the universe. Even video games like Bloodborne, Call of Cthulhu, and World of Warcraft, and shows like Stranger Things, are steeped in Lovecraftian dread, revealing his immense cultural footprint. In a strange twist of cosmic irony, even the solar system paid homage to him. In 2015, NASA named a dark region on Pluto Cthulhu Macula, while Mercury bears a crater simply named Lovecraft. For all his literary accomplishments, though, Lovecraft's legacy remains mired in controversy. His writing, brilliant as it is inseparable from his personal bigotries, views so vitriolic that they still spark fierce debate over whether we can or should separate the art from the artist. Some suggest Lovecraft's xenophobia was a reflection of his fear of the unknown, which also fueled his fiction. Others reject such justifications entirely, pointing to the vile racism in his poems like On the Creation of N******************** as irredeemable. In 2015, the World Fantasy Award removed his likeness from their trophy, replacing it with a more inclusive figure. Still, Lovecraft's influence remains undeniable. He transformed horror from tales of vampires and haunted castles into stories about existential dread, alien gods, and the fundamental insignificance of man. Ironically, a man so obsessed with decay, doom, and darkness gave birth to a literary movement that only grew stronger after his own demise. Lovecraft once wrote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." It was a philosophy born of a life riddled with abandonment, illness, alienation, and bitterness, a life where success arrived too late and clarity perhaps never came. Whether seen as a genius, a tragic case, or a deeply flawed prophet of cosmic horror, Lovecraft remains a figure of haunting contradiction. The man who saw monsters in the stars and found his place among them only after he was long gone. It's easy to forget in the age of mega-budget epics like Game of Thrones and Rings of Power, but the world enjoyed numerous fantasy television series throughout the 1980s and 90s. Were they a little cheesy? But for lovers of sword and sorcery and all things magical, they were a balm in a TV landscape saturated with family sitcoms and cop procedurals. There were series for adults like Xena, Warrior Princess, and plenty of shows for children, including hits like Fraggle Rock and Dungeons & Dragons. And as always, for every show that fans embraced, there are behind-the-scenes stories of the struggle to put it on the screen. Here are some of the more interesting behind-the-scenes stories from some of the most popular fantasy TV shows. Read on, and be sure to upvote the items that surprise or intrigue you. The human portions of Fraggle Rock were filmed differently for each country where it was shown. The human portions of Fraggle Rock were filmed differently for each country where it was shown. Is Fraggle Rock watchworthy? Fraggle Rock was another production from Jim Henson's studio, which blended live actors, Muppets, and songs in a fantastical setting. One thing the series did differently from similar series was that it was intended for international markets from the beginning. As such, there was a lot of thought and effort put into making the show appealing to children all over the world, which meant that some tweaks had to be made for foreign distribution. The series features a human Doc and Sprocket sequence, but depending on where it aired, it could have been one of 4 different sequences. The Muppet voices were done in a way that made it possible to dub them in any language. In England, Doc is a lighthouse keeper featured on an entirely different set. In France, he's a chef and Sprocket's name is Croquet. In Germany, Doc is an inventor, as he is in the original American version, but played by a different actor in German. Ron Perlman was recommended for Beauty and the Beast, because he didn't mind spending hours in makeup. Is Beauty and the Beast watchworthy? If there's one thing fans know about Ron Perlman, it's that he doesn't have a problem sitting in a makeup chair for hours on end. Throughout his career, he's shown up in numerous TV series and films with layers of makeup and prosthetics. From an early human in 1981's Quest for Fire to a demonic superhero in 2004's Hellboy. So it's no surprise to learn that he was top of mind when casting began for Beauty and the Beast. Casting began shortly after The Name of the Rose, in which Perlman was a supporting actor. Hit theaters in 1986. Rick Baker, the special effects wizard behind An American Werewolf in London and other classics, had a thought, as shared by Perlman in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. They were on the search for who was going to play Vincent in Beauty and the Beast. Rick Baker, who had already been hired to create the Beast makeup, said, "There's this guy who's done all this work in masks, and he's comfortable working that way, and he doesn't mind the 4 hours sitting in the chair. So he recommended me to the producers and the rest, as they say, is history."